3 weeks out from the wedding, I thought I had my life pretty well mapped out. After 2 years of dating, 6 months of engagement, and a couple of dozen "you sure about this?" talks from friends and family, I was ready to dive in. Julia seemed just as pumped. She'd planned every last detail down to the color of the napkin holders, and all I had to do was show up, say "I do," and play along as the happy groom. Not hard, right? One night, I was stuck at the office late, grinding through work so I could take off for the honeymoon with no loose ends. Around midnight, I got a text from my friend, Adam, who, for the record, is not a midnight kind of guy. He's the type who's asleep by 9 and wakes up by 5, no questions asked. So when his name popped up on my phone at that hour, I knew something was up. Adam's text wasn't just a "how's it going" check-in. Nope, he sent a photo. It was Julia, at some bar I didn't recognize, laughing way too close to some guy I didn't recognize either. I zoomed in, hoping it was just a trick of the angle, but the way she leaned into him, with his hand casually resting on her hip, no trick. She looked too damn comfortable. I thought about calling her right then, but I'd been around the block enough times to know not to jump to conclusions based on one photo. Maybe it was a friend or some weird misunderstanding, but still, the look in that photo stuck with me, and I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning she greeted me with the usual morning sweetness, kisses, coffee, and talk about cake tasting for the wedding. She seemed so calm, so at ease. It threw me off. I told myself maybe the photo wasn't what it looked like. I casually asked if she was out the night before, fully expecting her to say yes, maybe even explain away the mystery man. Instead, she barely blinked before saying she had a quiet night in. A bit too quick for my liking, but I kept my mouth shut, knowing that going all detective mode might make things worse if this was all in my head. A couple of days later, I couldn't let it go. So, I did a bit of digging. I went through her messages. Don't judge me, I was already feeling like something was wrong. That's when I found a whole back and forth with this guy from the bar, who she apparently knew quite well. His name was Alex, and their messages went beyond casual friendship. They were texts about how much they missed each other, and couldn't wait to catch up after the engagement party, a party I'd naively thought was all about us celebrating together. The text stretched back months. It wasn't even a one-time thing. They'd been meeting up since before I proposed. The worst part, Julia was still talking to him, texting him on days when we were planning our lives together. It was like some hidden layer of our relationship peeled back, revealing things I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Instead of going straight to her, I decided to sit with it a few days. Call it self-torture, but I wanted to see if she'd own up to it on her own, show some kind of remorse, maybe even end it on her terms. We had a family dinner a couple of days later, and she played her part perfectly, smiling, laughing, talking about all the plans she had for the wedding. She looked at me like I was her whole world, like I was the only guy in the room. Meanwhile, my mind kept flipping back to her messages with Alex, the way she told him, "It'll always be us." Us. Wasn't I supposed to be us? I started pulling away, not enough to make a scene, but enough to make her notice. She'd ask me if I was okay, and I'd just smile and say I was tired or preoccupied. She'd nod and move on, and I'd sit there feeling like I was watching some kind of twisted play, where everyone else saw a love story, but I knew the tragic ending. One night, a week before the wedding, I invited her out to dinner at her favorite restaurant. I'd been trying to keep it together, but seeing her sit across from me, looking like she couldn't be happier, it was like something snapped. Halfway through, I pulled out my phone, opened to the messages between her and Alex, and slid it across the table. She froze, staring at the screen for what felt like ages, then looked up at me. There was no point in talking. I didn't need an explanation, and she knew damn well I wasn't buying excuses. She just muttered, "I'm sorry," barely a whisper, as if saying it loud would break her. But I was already broken. I asked her how long it had been going on, and she barely managed to say, "Since last year." Last year. That meant she'd been seeing him the whole time we were planning a life together, while I was figuring out finances, budgeting for a house, even rethinking career plans to fit her goals. And she'd kept this up, knowing full well she was lying every time we discussed our future. We barely spoke as we left the restaurant. I told her I'd be staying with a friend until we could figure out what to tell people. I moved out the next day, and she tried calling, texting, begging me to reconsider, saying she was confused and lost. But the damage was done, and there was no coming back from that. I canceled everything, told our families. They were stunned, of course, and people kept asking why, what happened, as if I owed them an explanation. I kept it vague at first, just said we'd grown apart, until one of her friends started asking too many questions, and I finally broke and spilled everything. The fallout was rough. Julia tried reaching out a few times, claiming she'd made a mistake and she'd always loved me, but it was too late. The months of lies had added up, and whatever trust we'd built was gone. In the end, I walked away from the wedding, the plans, and Julia herself. I kept thinking about all the things I'd missed, the signs I hadn't seen, but that was on her, not me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. If you'd asked me a year ago, hell, even 6 months ago, I'd have told you that my wife, Emily, was my world. We met at a college party, the loud, obnoxious kind neither of us usually enjoyed, but somehow we'd both been dragged to. We locked eyes across a room filled with red Solo cups and bass-heavy music, and I remember this feeling of, there, right there, that's the one. Within weeks we were inseparable. Fast forward to 8 years later, we were still that couple everyone looked up to. Married for 5 years, we had the house, the dog, and plans for a family. I'd never felt a reason to question her love, her loyalty. We had our ups and downs, like any couple, but we were solid, or so I thought. I'd never expected to lose her trust, or worse, to lose her heart to someone else. I first noticed something different about her around a year ago. It was subtle, the kind of thing you brush off as a rough patch. Maybe stress from work, or just growing apart in minor ways. She'd go out more often, tell me she was meeting up with her girlfriends or grabbing drinks after work. I didn't think twice about it at first. I trusted her, and I wanted her to have her own life outside of us. Then, one evening, I noticed her texting someone a little too intently. I asked, "Who's that?" in a casual, almost lazy way, but she froze for a second. Just a second, but long enough for that pit in my stomach to start forming. "Just Jess," she said, referring to her old friend from high school, Jess. I nodded, didn't think much more of it, but something about her body language, her awkward laugh, told me more than her words. I shrugged it off, didn't think much of it, told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake that feeling that something was off. Weeks went by, and her behavior grew stranger. Her phone, once left lying around, was now glued to her hand, and she'd put it face down whenever she sat beside me. Small things started to add up. She'd laugh at messages but wouldn't say why, and when I'd ask, she'd get defensive or dismiss me with an eye roll and a "you're being ridiculous." The pit in my stomach grew every time. One evening, as she was out with Jess again, I was scrolling through old Facebook photos, feeling nostalgic, and stumbled upon one of her high school pictures. She was young, grinning beside a guy I didn't recognize. I clicked the photo to enlarge it, realizing the guy had commented recently with a winking emoji. A simple wink, but it struck me as off. I scrolled through his profile and pieced together that he was her high school sweetheart, Josh. They'd dated through high school and, from what I could tell, had a bit of an on and off thing before she and I met. I knew she'd had a past, we all do. But what hit me like a sucker punch was seeing recent photos of them together. laughing over drinks in places I didn't recognize. Her favorite little bookstore. The downtown bar she told me she'd stopped going to. All those times she was with Jess. My blood ran cold, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it. I tried to chalk it up to an innocent friendship, but each time I saw another picture of them, smiling and just a little too close, the pit in my stomach grew. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept telling myself to trust her, that I was being irrational, but the evidence was staring me right in the face. I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating as I sat there with her phone in my hand, unlocked while she was in the shower. In her messages, there it was. Josh's name popped up in recent conversations, their texts like a punch to the gut. I read message after message, my heart breaking with every word. "Ah, I miss you, Em," he'd written. She'd replied with a "miss you too," and some inside joke I didn't understand. Then, in one message, she'd said, "Can't wait to see you again. Remember the good old days." My mind raced, trying to fit the pieces together. They'd been meeting for months, rekindling their old relationship right under my nose. Every "I love you" she'd given me was laced with lies. I sat there, numb, feeling like the walls were closing in. It was one thing to suspect, but seeing it spelled out in her own words was a different kind of agony. Later that day, I confronted her, barely able to hold back the hurt and anger bubbling up inside me. I tried to stay calm, but my voice cracked as I showed her the messages. She froze, a guilty look passing over her face before she composed herself. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice shaking. "We're just friends, reminiscing, that's all." But I couldn't believe her. Friends don't text each other the way they were. Friends don't lie to their husbands, don't sneak off to reminisce about the past they once shared. I pressed her, not letting her excuses slide, and finally, with tears streaming down her face, she admitted it. They'd reconnected, sure, but it hadn't stopped there. "It just happened," she said, as if that explained everything. She said she'd been feeling distant from me, that reconnecting with Josh brought back memories of who she used to be, made her feel alive again. I was furious, devastated, every ounce of trust shattered. After that, our relationship became a war zone. I couldn't look at her without feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. I'd built my life around this woman, trusted her with everything, and now everything felt like a lie. She tried to apologize, to explain, but her words fell flat. She tried to promise me it was over with Josh, that she'd made a mistake, but I couldn't believe her anymore. I'd catch her glancing at her phone, the way her eyes would light up when she thought I wasn't watching, and I knew she was still in touch with him. Finally, I made the hardest decision I'd ever had to make. I packed my bags, left our house, and filed for divorce. She begged me to reconsider, to forgive her, but I couldn't. The betrayal ran too deep. Every memory we'd made together felt tainted, and I knew I could never look at her the same way again. It's been months now since I walked away. Some days the anger still bubbles up, the bitterness that she'd thrown everything away for a fleeting connection to her past. But slowly, I'm learning to move forward, to trust myself again. I've realized that her betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth, but of her inability to let go of the past. Every now and then, I'll get a message from her, a simple "I'm sorry" or "I miss you." But I know better now. There's no going back, no erasing the pain she caused. I'm finding peace in my own way, even if it means starting over alone. I always trusted her. From the moment we met, I knew there was something unshakable between us. At least that's what I'd convinced myself. We built a life together, layer upon layer, year upon year. We had our routines, our shared dreams, even our little arguments. It all felt solid, like bedrock. Until that night. It was my parents' anniversary. A small gathering at their place, just family and close friends. My parents adored her. They'd welcomed her with open arms, treated her like their own daughter, and she always seemed to fit in so naturally. She laughed at my dad's corny jokes, helped my mom set the table, and even joined in when my sister started teasing me about my high school hairstyle. It felt perfect, like we were all just right. Then came the moment that would change everything. After dinner, everyone started gathering in the living room. I'd gone into the kitchen to grab a few drinks, trying to make sure everything was running smoothly. When I came back, I noticed she was missing. The conversation carried on as usual, but a strange unease started building in me. I told myself I was overthinking, that maybe she'd just stepped outside for some air. But minutes ticked by, and she didn't return. Curiosity, and something darker I couldn't quite name, drove me to go find her. I walked down the hallway, peeking into the empty rooms, feeling my heart pick up speed. And then I saw it. The door to the guest room was open just a crack, and there was her silhouette, pressed close to another figure. Not just close, intimate. It felt like my stomach had dropped out of my body. In that instant, my mind went blank, numb. I pushed the door open, and there she was, standing with him. Someone I didn't even know, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with me in months. I think I froze. I could feel everything around me blur, like the walls were closing in. She finally noticed me standing there, her laughter dying in her throat as she looked up, her face going pale. The man with her, a stranger as far as I knew, had the audacity to look back at me with a smirk, as if he'd won something. I didn't even register walking into the room. All I remember was the anger that surged up in me like a wildfire, so intense I could barely breathe. Words started spilling out, accusations, questions, things I don't even remember saying. My voice echoed down the hall, and soon enough, I saw my parents standing behind me, their faces a mix of confusion and worry. Her silence felt like knives stabbing into me. She didn't deny it, didn't say a single word to explain herself. My parents looked at her, disbelief mingling with the same betrayal I felt tearing through me. It was like she'd shattered something fundamental, not just between us, but in my entire family. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not what it looks like." Those words, those tired, empty words that people use to cover up the truth, they only made it worse. I tried to understand, to make sense of how the woman I'd shared my life with, the woman I thought I knew, could be standing here in front of me, lying to my face in front of my own family. There was no reason, no excuse that could ever make it right, and the look in her eyes, defeated, almost apathetic, told me that this wasn't a mistake, this was a choice. Days turned into weeks, but the shock never really faded. Every time I looked at my parents, I saw their disappointment, their sadness, and it was like reliving that night over and over. My friends tried to reach out, tried to be there for me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of shame, like I'd somehow let everyone down by trusting her. The memories we shared became like broken glass, sharp, painful. Every time I thought of a happy moment, it was tainted by what she'd done. And yet, part of me still wanted to understand why. Why risk everything we'd built? Why in front of my parents, in our safe place? When we finally sat down to talk, weeks after it all unraveled, her answer stunned me. She admitted she felt stifled, like our life was too predictable. She wanted excitement, something different. It was like she'd torn down everything we'd built together, just because she'd gotten bored. Yes, the betrayal cut deeper than any apology she could have offered. Moving on felt impossible, but slowly I found my footing again. My family became my anchor, and their support reminded me that life goes on. They helped me reclaim parts of myself that I thought I'd lost in the wake of her betrayal. And eventually, I realized that the pain she'd caused me wouldn't define me. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And as I rebuilt piece by piece, I found a strength I didn't know I had, one that could only come from surviving a heartbreak like this. We'd been together for nearly a decade. The story of our lives was woven into 1,000 small moments. The way we met during that first corporate conference, the clumsy first date that turned into 3 days of endless conversation, and the shared dreams that kept us going through long work hours and endless bills. We were a team, or at least that's what I always believed. When she got her new job, I was thrilled for her. She'd worked hard for that promotion. The late nights, the weekend sacrifices, and endless self-doubt finally seemed to pay off. She deserved every bit of it. And when she told me about her new boss, Jacob, a guy she said was brilliant, a real visionary, I thought nothing of it. I was genuinely happy she was learning from someone she respected. But things changed, slowly at first, like cracks in a foundation I thought was solid. At first, it was just extra hours, an occasional canceled dinner, and a few work trips that she said she couldn't get out of. I wanted to support her, so I waved it off. But after a while, those moments became habits. She was almost never home before 9 p.m., and when she was either glued to her phone or too exhausted to even talk. There was a distance growing between us, an unspoken barrier that wasn't there before. I convinced myself it was just the job, that this was the price of success, but some part of me knew better. Some primal instinct inside was screaming that something was wrong. One evening, I decided to surprise her at work. I hadn't planned anything grand, just a little gesture, a coffee, and her favorite chocolate croissant from the bakery nearby. I thought maybe we could grab a quick dinner after work. As I reached her office building, as I saw her car in the parking lot, which meant she was still there, I waited, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. But that anticipation quickly turned to unease when I saw her stepping out of the building with Jacob. She was laughing, that same carefree laugh she used to share with me. And he had this casual arm slung around her shoulders. They didn't see me, and I didn't approach them. Instead, I turned around, left the coffee and croissant on the ground, and walked away. I told myself not to overthink it, but the image of them together was seared into my brain. The following days were pure agony. I was torn between asking her outright and just ignoring it, hoping it would disappear like a bad dream. But the more I thought about it, the more things didn't add up. There was the mysterious work trip she had to take on our anniversary, the constant text she was always too tired to explain, and the nervousness in her eyes whenever I mentioned her boss. One night, after she had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through social media, trying to distract myself. But then, in a moment of weakness, I went to her work profile and scrolled through her posts. There were a few tagged photos from her recent work trip, and there he was, Jacob, smiling with her, standing a bit too close for comfort. But it wasn't the photo that gutted me, it was the comments. People from her work joking about how they were the dream team and always together. One comment even joked, "Might as well make it official, you two." I stared at my screen, anger and betrayal twisting inside me like a knife. When she came downstairs the next morning, looking at me with those same warm eyes, I felt a surge of resentment. I didn't say anything, but my silence must have been obvious because she asked if something was wrong. I told her I was just tired, busy with work. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, not yet. I needed to know for sure. So I started noticing things I'd ignored before. Her phone was always face down, and she guarded it as if it held national secrets. I knew her passcode, but felt like a criminal just considering going through it. One evening, while she was in the shower, I did the unthinkable. My hands were shaking as I picked up her phone. It was worse than I could have imagined. Messages, late-night calls, the business dinners she claimed were necessary. Everything was there in black and white. The words were too intimate, the flirting too blatant. She called him babe. She even told him that he made her feel alive, something she hadn't said to me in years. I put the phone down, feeling a numbness settle over me, the kind that comes when something inside you breaks beyond repair. I didn't say anything for days. I'd go to work, go through the motions, and then come home to her. We'd sit at the same dinner table, sleep in the same bed, and yet everything felt hollow. I could barely look at her without feeling a flood of anger and heartbreak. One evening, she came home late, again. She walked in, muttering some excuse about a last-minute meeting with Jacob. But this time, I didn't let it slide. I asked her, point blank, why she was late. She looked taken aback, caught off guard. She stammered something about work, but I cut her off. I told her I knew about her and Jacob, that I'd seen the messages, that I wasn't a fool. The words spilled out like a dam breaking, my voice shaking with every accusation. At first, she denied it, her face a mask of shock and indignation. She tried to paint me as paranoid, controlling, accusing me of overreacting. But when I brought up the messages, the ones where she called him babe, her face fell. She couldn't deny it anymore. She finally admitted it, but not with the remorse I had hoped for. Instead, she blamed me, blamed our stagnant relationship, the lack of excitement. I stood there, numb, barely able to process the words coming out of her mouth. All the years we'd spent together, all the memories we'd built, it was like they meant nothing to her. She didn't apologize, didn't beg for forgiveness. She just stood there, saying she didn't know how things had gotten this bad, as if she were some helpless victim of fate rather than the architect of her own betrayal. In the days that followed, I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay in a place filled with memories of a life that had turned out to be a lie. Friends tried to reach out, family offered their support, but all I could do was go through the motions, drifting from one day to the next. The wound is still raw, the betrayal still fresh. I still lie awake at night, haunted by the image of them together, the laughter they shared while I sat at home, blissfully ignorant. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover, if I'll ever trust again, but one thing's for sure. I'll never let anyone make a fool of me like that again.